Thank you all for coming out. My name is Matt Wetstein, and I'll be speaking about ranked choice voting for Iowa on behalf of Better Ballot Iowa. I'm going to start by asking the question that I ask myself just about every day of every week, which is, why the heck am I here? I'm a little bit about myself. I live here in Ames with my family, my wife and two children. I'm a professor at Iowa State University. And in my spare time, I'm working on advocating for voting reforms. And what really got me moving was fear for the future for my children, and the creeping realization that I could no longer be a spectator and stand on the sidelines. I really needed to get involved. And as I said, it was a creeping realization, but like a lot of folks, I feel like a major moment for me, or red flag, was the 2016 election. Now, whatever your opinions of either of the candidates, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, I think everybody can agree that election represented a sort of new dark moment in American politics, where things took a nosedive, where divisiveness, the antipathy reached a boiling point. And that was the first time I really viscerally felt like our country and our future is vulnerable. Fast forward to the present, and it's arguable that things have gotten worse, not better. Now, let me ask the folks who are listening on this call, how many of you get knots in your stomach every time the subject of politics comes up in polite conversation, whether we're talking family Thanksgiving dinners or among coworkers? Who here feels almost enraged by political news at least once a week? And who on this call feels like their voice isn't being heard in Washington, or for that matter, in Des Moines? Well, most Americans feel that way. We're all extremely frustrated. We're all very angry. And that's an experience that speaks across all partisan bounds. The only thing that we can't seem to agree on is what to do about it. But what I'd like to offer tonight is that maybe there's a modest step forward that we can take to indeed address these problems. I'm going to offer you tonight that a lot of the frustration and antipathy in American politics is part of a greater crisis of accountability. Simply put, politicians are no longer accountable to the voting public. And so in the course of this talk, I'd like to address where accountability comes from, why it seems to be so lacking these days, and what we can do to restore it in this country. Now, if I'm going to ask you, if accountability is the thing that we want, what is the tool that we, the voters, have to hold officials accountable? It's not great sums of money. It's not vast connections, and it's most of us don't have access to a large media empire. What we have to hold our leaders accountable is voting, the great equalizer. If our politicians fail us, if they fail to do their job, we can vote them out. At least that's how it's supposed to work on paper. Well, if voting is our main handle for holding politicians accountable, I would like to offer to you that the mechanism, the mechanics of how we vote are critically important. And this is something that most people take for granted. Our voting system is something that's sort of invisible, operating in the backgrounds. Well, tonight, I invite you to take a deep dive with me. So what is our current voting system? In most of the country, and certainly in Iowa, we have what's often referred to as a pick one voting system. The technical name for it is plurality voting. Some folks refer to it as first past the post. And it works like this. Each voter picks one candidate. The candidate with the most votes wins. Sounds fair, right? Well, it's certainly simple, but its simplicity may be its only virtue. And we're gonna look at where it really starts to break down. And I'd like to start by giving you an exercise with a sample ballot. Let's imagine an election between candidate A and evil incarnate. Now, some of you folks may be chuckling But the fact is, this is the experience that most voters have at the ballot. Most voters have one candidate who they like or more likely just tolerate, and one candidate who they would never in a million years vote for. And I want to ask, is that choice? And does that build accountability? Well, let's think about it. Let's say you're in a district where candidate A has a clear majority support from his party. And so candidate A wins election after election. Does your vote really matter to candidate A? It doesn't, because candidate A knows you're not going to vote for the other person. Your vote is captive. Similarly, evil incarnate has no obligations, no need to try to appeal to you, because the evil candidate will never get your vote. If your vote is fixed, then there's no competition. There's no need for politicians to reach out and listen to what you have to say. Those of us who've ever bought a car or owned a house, or even just if you've bargained in an open market, know that power is in the ability to walk away. If you can walk away, it's on the salesperson to keep you there, to be attentive to your needs, and to make a case for why you should stay. The problem is, in modern American politics, most Americans have no one to walk away to. And it gets really crazy because the vast majority of voting districts in this country are local monopolies. A lot of people don't know this, but more than 90% of congressional districts are safe seats, meaning that one party has total control to the point where it's a given. There's not a strong push for advertisement. In many cases, candidates don't even bother to run opposition against somebody running for the House or Senate. And this problem is actually getting worse with time, not better. So again, I ask, does that create accountability? Well, in any other context, we know that when there's no competition and there's no alternatives, the customer loses. So why are we tolerating this in our political life? New election. Candidate A is running again for the 4th or 5th time. Candidate A is, again, mediocre. They're doing okay, not really accomplishing much. They're running against evil incarnate. But this time, another candidate who you really like, frustrated with the status quo, has decided to throw their hat in the race. And this candidate appeals to a lot of folks like you who tend to usually vote for candidate A. Who do you vote for? I want to let you stew on this for a few minutes. Some of you will recognize right away what I'm getting at. Others, this might be the first time you've encountered it. If you're like me, you're very uncomfortable by this ballot. This ballot stresses me out a lot. Why am I stressed? Well, let's take a look. Let's imagine that if it was a two-way race, candidate A has a solid lead against evil incarnate. 57% of the vote, they're going to win, right? Now, this new candidate runs. If they take votes away from candidate A, now evil incarnate wins the election. There are a few features that I want to bring to your attention here. The first is that the candidate who won the election did not win with a majority of the vote. They did not have more than 50% of the vote. They didn't win because the public at large wanted them to win. In fact, the majority of the public actually wanted them to lose. Instead, they won by a pure accident that nobody decided to split off their vote. Not because they were liked, but because the other candidates' votes got split off more than theirs. And this is the problem with the plurality or single vote system. It can lead to non-majority outcomes when you have more than two candidates. And it creates this situation where voters are tearing their hair out over the possibility of vote splitting, and they're forced to vote strategically. This is a system that inherently puts you in a situation where instead of who you're voting for, you're constantly worried about who you're voting against. It naturally sets up a false dichotomy. You know, we talk about false dichotomies as a logical fallacy, and yet it's almost baked into our election. Most people think that the winner of the election has to have more than 50% of the vote, but that's simply not the case. A lot of places will do runoff elections, not the majority, But those runoff elections are costly and they suffer from poor voter turnout. In Iowa, and this happens fairly frequently, people are elected to the House or the Senate without more than 50% of the vote. And that's just simply the reality of how our voting works. Now, let me bring you back to this ballot. I want to underscore how much this stinks. We had a ballot and we added more choices and better options, and that made things worse. That is crazy to me. And when you think about it, the new person who you really like is going to walk out of this election as, you know, the greatest villain of political history. People are going to boo her off the stage. More realistically, and this is what actually happens in our country, she would have never run in the first place. The first sign that this candidate you really like is a reasonable person is that they would calculate that it would not be in their interest to run in the first place. And so this is called the spoiler effect, and it locks out new voices. It's sort of a regulation on the marketplace of ideas that prevents new ideas and new people from entering the race. So what can we do about this? How can we ensure majority outcomes in elections in a way that accommodates more than two candidates? How do we address the problem of the spoiler effect? Do we eliminate candidates from the ballot? No, this is America. The answer is ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is a system that lets you pick the candidate who you really want to choose, and you rank all of the candidates, as many as you like, in the order of your preference. Your first choice is followed by a series of backup choices. If your first choice is eliminated, then your vote goes to your next choice. This process continues until one of the candidates ends up with the majority of in-play votes. Okay, I'm going to give you all an illustration now of what that actually looks like in an actual simulated election on a grand scale, not just on a ballot. So in this hypothetical election, again, we've got the candidate that you really like. We've got candidate A. We've got evil incarnate, and another candidate that takes some of evil incarnate's base. We'll call it trash heap. Now, in the first round of the ranked choice voting, so everybody's ranked their ballots and we count everybody's first choice. In a ranked choice election, if any candidate gets 50% on the first choice, the election is over. They are the winner, hands down. But if no candidate gets 50% of the votes, the first thing you do is simply eliminate the candidate with the least votes. In this case, it's trash heap. Now, what happens to trash heap's voters? Do their votes disappear like in our single vote system? No, their votes go on to their next choice. Most of them in round two, obviously had as their second choice, evil incarnate, but a few of them even like the candidate that you like for whatever reason. Now we're on round three, and we still don't have a clear majority winner. And so we eliminate the next least vote getter, who is, of course, candidate A in this scenario. Now, some of candidate A's bitter voters' second choice goes to evil incarnate, but the vast majority of them go to the candidate you like. We get to 53%. Candidate B, we'll call her, wins the election with a majority of the vote, and the election is now over. Ranked choice voting is a simple tweak, but it has a very big impact. It addresses this central problem in American politics of the spoiler effect that keeps new ideas from entering the race. It makes majority winners more likely, and it is a more expressive ballot that better reflects the will of the voters. In doing so, it opens our election system up to something that American politics desperately needs: innovation, new ideas, more competition, more choice. It doesn't guarantee it, but it at least opens up the possibility to new entrants coming into elections and challenging stagnant districts where the candidate has been winning again and again and again and nothing ever happens. It's a much more expressive form of voting in the sense that it tells candidates much more than they would know under a plurality ballot. If you won with 40% of the vote, you don't know at all where the rest of your base stands. And so you don't know who to care about, who to worry about. In a ranked choice voting election, candidates know where they stand with the voters who didn't choose them first. And they also know who's missing from their coalition. And so it gives elected officials a sense of how popular they really are. Ranked choice voting also creates incentives for broader coalitions. Unlike our plurality system, where if the vote gets split enough, a strong minority base can take the win, in a ranked choice voting election, candidates need to get to that 50% threshold. That means that, and in many cases, they might be competing with more than two candidates. That means, first of all, they actually got to do their job and go out and talk to voters. But more importantly, they're not just worried about the voters who choose them first. They're also worried about securing second place votes, second choice votes, because those votes could mean the difference between winning or losing. That means that your vote matters to a candidate, even if you aren't in their party. They have a chance to potentially communicate with you and get you to bump them up on your ranking. And so again, this is a situation or a context that breeds more accountability. In addition, another positive side effect is that ranked choice voting leads to more positive campaigns. A Rutgers Eagleton poll showed that individuals who live in districts that use ranked choice voting, or rather towns and cities that use ranked choice voting, they experience more positive campaigning and less negative campaigning than people who live in cities and municipalities that use plurality voting. And the reason for that is simple. If somebody's trying to win my number 2 vote, they're not going to alienate me by attacking my first choice vote. And so it flips the script on how elections work. Instead of winning elections by attacking the other candidate, instead of winning elections by telling me why I shouldn't vote for the other guy, politicians have to win elections by arguing why I should vote for them. And that's a very different kind of politics than we're seeing today. Not only does it encourage more civility in the campaign among the candidates, but it also creates incentives for more voter dialogue. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm I'm door knocking for the purple candidate. I show up at a house that has an orange candidate sign. Now, in our current system, I see that sign, I don't bother to knock. I already know that person is spoken for. It's not worth my time. But under ranked choice voting, I go and I knock on the door. The person comes to the door and I tell them, I know you're voting for the orange candidate. I'm here advocating for the purple candidate. Let me explain to you why my candidate cares about many of the issues that you care about and why you should rank my candidate as a number 2. And so again, there is this more rich deliberation involved in how we behave during a ranked choice voting election. In fact, one of the arguments that I like to make for the value of ranked choice voting is less about what happens on election day and more about the impact that it has on the weeks and months leading up to the election, how it changes the way we engage in and think about politics. Now, I hope at this point that I've convinced you all that this is a very exciting development, but I'm sure that the skeptics among you are wondering, is this winnable? Well, I'm very excited to say that not only is it winnable, but it's already winning. RCV is having its moment nationally. Already in the last 5 years, 2 states have adopted ranked choice voting. The state of Maine in 2018. In fact, Maine was the first state ever in the history of the US to use ranked choice voting in a presidential election. I'll point out parenthetically that that's not super consequential. It won't really affect presidential politics until all the states adopt it, but it's still an important milestone. And Alaska adopted ranked choice voting in 2020, and there's going to be a very interesting Senate race coming up this year, and I encourage you all to watch what happens when you get rid of partisan primaries and have a top four candidate general election with ranked choice voting. It's going to be, I think, very exciting. One of the things that's exciting about both of these states is how engaged the grassroots movement to get this passed was, and how they were able to achieve a majority, over 50% support from all voters voting for the ballot initiatives that got these passed. But ranked choice voting isn't just winning at the state level. In 2021, a record number of cities used ranked choice voting, 32 cities in 7 states. 20 of those cities alone were added in Utah just for this election that just happened. And after the election, voters in Utah were polled on what they thought of ranked choice city elections, and it polled at 80%. Now, that's not 100% like I'd wish, but I'll tell you, in politics these days, 80% polling is pretty unheard of. You're lucky if you can get 50.1% support of anything. In November 2nd, on election day, more cities voted to add RCV through ballot measures. I think 3 more cities were added to the list. This is just a map of everywhere that ranked choice voting is currently being used. In addition to state and local and federal elections, it's also being used by a number of states for military and overseas voting. Beyond the actual passage of ranked choice voting bills and the adoption of it in cities, I just want to point out that in the last 4 years, there has been a massive groundswell of support at the grassroots from folks like myself who are stepping out of the woodwork and trying to get this passed. These are the logos of all the organizations that have been started in just the last 4 years, groups like Better Ballot Iowa. And we're all linking together through this sort of, I'd call it a trade organization called Rank the Vote nationally. And it's super exciting because we have an opportunity to actually talk to each other and see what folks are trying in different states and what is or isn't working. And I'll point out this Sunday happens to be National RCV Day. We're going to be doing some phone banking, and there's a celebratory Zoom call nationwide that night. If you're interested, do please reach out. Another reason why ranked choice voting, I would argue, is a very viable reform is that it has support from across the political spectrum. The corollary to that, of course, is it also has opposition from across the political spectrum, usually from folks in the status quo who would maybe be upset by this. But Democrats have a tremendous number of blue cities like San Francisco, New York City, Minneapolis that have all adopted it. It's a very, very popular in progressive circles. I have an example here of a really interesting article by Maya Wiley, who, even though she lost the mayoral race, she was very excited by how ranked choice voting boosted the representation of women and minorities in ranked choice voting, because again, it better reflects the electorate. But it's not just liberals. The Republicans, conservative-minded folks are also very interested in ranked choice voting. The arguments of competition, of excellence, of sort of open free markets of ideas very much appeal to Republican thinking. There are a lot of conservatives who are behind this. The Utah state legislature, as I just mentioned, passed a bill legalizing it in municipalities. And that's huge because that's an 80% red state legislature. The Virginia GOP used it in their primaries this past year, and it selected Glenn Youngkin, who went on to win the governorship. Indiana used it for their primaries as well. And the article that I have a headline from was written by a Republican strategist talking about why he feels that this is very good for the Republican Party. The fact is, it doesn't really advantage or disadvantage any party. There are obviously specific elections that you can point to. You could say, in this district, it'll give the Democrats more of an edge. In this district, it'll give the Republicans more of an edge. But on the whole, it's really hard to argue that this favors one side or the other. And of course, third party and independents really like this idea. And it's worth pointing out that 62% of Americans in a recent Gallup poll said that they believe a third party is needed. The Green Party, Alliance Party, Forward Party, and Libertarian parties all officially endorse ranked choice voting as part of their official platforms. Another reason why this is doable is that Iowa already has the infrastructure for RCV. All of the machines we use to scan our ballots are forward compatible with ranked choice ballots. We just need to print different ballots and program the software differently. I don't want to trivialize it. There's work to be done, but we were ranked by the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center as with a score of 95%, an A, in terms of our ranked choice voting readiness. And I've got a link to the report here. Maybe one of my colleagues can post that in the chat for folks that are interested in reading more. So how do we get there? I'll start with the bad news. Unlike the 2 states that have passed it so far at the state level, we don't have ballot initiatives here in Iowa. We cannot petition. For those who are not familiar, the way that a ballot initiative works is you go around, you get signatures, and then you get the measure on the ballot so that the people can vote for it. It's sort of a way of sidestepping the legislature. And in the case of both Maine and Alaska, that's how they got it through. In fact, one of the impressive things about Maine is that it ended up going to vote twice because it was challenged and it won both times. But we can't do that here in Iowa. The only way we can get this through is to work with the state legislature. Now, I don't see that as a deal breaker, but it does present challenges. It's hard to ask lawmakers to change the rules of how they themselves are elected. I'm hopeful that we can actually make a positive case to them. In my opinion, from talking to elected officials, many of them feel like they are hostages to a system that gives them bad incentives. They're doing things that they themselves find detestable, but they don't feel like they have another choice. And so I think if we appeal to the fact that changing politics might make the circumstances of their leadership and their experience as lawmakers more positive, I think many of them could see as a positive step. That being said, we might need to be more strategic in how we go about this. And so one could consider a few possible ways of adopting it. One would be to go gung-ho. 4 years from now, we just try to pass everything. But another possibility would be to try to adopt RCV in stages, to do something of a smaller scale first to whet the public appetite, to get people excited about ranked choice voting. One possible first step that we're considering is local initiatives bill first, where we pass a bill that allows towns to choose to use ranked choice voting. Right now, the way that the law is written in Iowa, it's not intentionally written in a way to prevent RCV, but the wording is such that it is not legal to practice ranked choice voting in Iowa. So the city of Ames couldn't choose to have a ranked choice voting election. But we could try to persuade the legislature to legalize it for municipal elections. I find this very appealing because this is exactly what they did in Utah. And it's Utah's, a very, I think, similar partisan bent to where Iowa is leaning right now. And it's a legislative state. So I think in a lot of ways that is a potentially good model for us to look to. It addresses this issue of not asking the lawmakers to change the rules of how they're elected because they're going one level down. We could also go one level up and just legalize ranked choice voting for federal elections based on the argument of, hey, state legislature, you want to fix the problems in Washington, D.C.? And that is something that might be appealing to them. A last option that could bring attention to ranked choice voting would be the Iowa caucus, which, as folks know, was a little bit messy in the last election, the caucus in 2020. And one could imagine modifying it, still keeping it as a caucus, but complementing it with paper ballots that are ranked. This would enable folks who can't attend in person to be able to vote absentee. But it's also a way to streamline the process of how the in-person vote happens. It could still be very deliberative, but it might end with people filling out a ranked ballot. And that's a way that we could bring it into the national limelight without necessarily having to jump straight to the state legislature. So I've talked a little bit about some thinking on how we could get there, but now I really should talk about our group, Better Ballot Iowa. So who are we? Well, we're newly formed as of March of 2021. We are fully Iowa founded. It's a bunch of us that met each other online in 2020, and we've been talking ever since. And eventually, our discussions led to Better Ballot Iowa. It's an entirely volunteer-based organization at the moment. We are hoping to hire our first organizer, but right now we're all volunteer, and it's volunteer-led. We're doggedly nonpartisan. We really are reaching out to try to get folks from all sides of the political spectrum. And above all, we're just getting started. These are just some pictures from our recent leadership strategy retreat. The thing I want to call your attention to, which I'm super proud of, is the pins on the map at the bottom. You can see that we had representation from all over Iowa. Well, I mean, it's a little bit concentrated on the I-80 corridor. We need to work on getting it more out to the north and the south, but we do have quite a geographic spread among us. We're interested in nonpartisan reforms to our election system with the goal of making American democracy and Iowa democracy, I should say, stronger. And a rubric for that would be reforms that make elections more competitive, that bake in more accountability, that provide politicians with incentives for more coalition building and good governments, openness to new ideas and leaders, and in general, elections that are better reflective of the public. Now, that's kind of our general perspective and position, but right now we're really laser focused on ranked choice voting. And that's for a very simple reason that we believe that the organizational discipline that is necessary, even to just get ranked choice voting passed, is going to require most of our resources, but also that ranked choice voting is probably the highest benefit to lowest cost line of attack that we can make as a first step towards even more bold reforms in the future. This is a way to get the public really thinking that they don't have to take the system the way it is. They can actually participate in constructive change. We're a 501c3. It's a nonprofit organization. Donations to us are tax deductible. And that's because our mission is not really as much political right now as it is educational. And that's a strategic decision. And I'll ask you folks, what do you think is the largest obstacle to passing ranked choice voting right now? Since there's not a ton of audience participation and I can't see the chat right now, I'm just gonna gander that many of you think it's getting it passed to the legislature. And that's certainly going to be a tough egg to crack. But more importantly, our biggest obstacle is the fact that 9 out of 10 Iowans have never heard of ranked choice voting. And I can say this with the experience of having been out canvassing all over the state. It's not something that most Iowans have heard of. It's a challenge because it's a completely green field, but it's also very exciting. It's part of what makes, I think, this enterprise so rewarding, is that we are talking to people about a subject in such a saturated area. Politics is so saturated right now, and we're talking to people who are blank slates, and we get to watch those light bulbs light up. And the other thing that's amazing about it is, you know, I get to talk to people who hold political views that I find repulsive, and yet we're able to connect on this. We're able to find common ground and find a constructive way that we can go forward that can maybe repair the political culture that makes us see each other's views as repulsive in the first place. The other reason why we are a 501c3 is a strategic one, and that's because a lot of activist groups put the cart before the horse. They try to jump right into the legal enactment campaign. They start picking up the phone, calling their state legislatures. And the fact is, there is a lot of noise. As I just said, the political sphere is highly saturated. And so you end up putting in a lot of effort, and it can be pretty exhausting. Our strategy, the model that we're following, is to grow first, to build the capacity, to build the public will, and the strength we need to then move on to creating to a legal campaign. And at that point, we might, you know, spin off a 501c4 or some sort of other political lobbying group. But right now, our focus is on 3 things: people, money, and endorsements. People, of course, is supporters. Money is money, and endorsements, I think, is even though we're not ready to really crack the egg of endorsements fully yet, we're working on it this year. In the longer run, that's going to be the most important part. Getting buy-in from local community, religious thought leaders, political leaders, business leaders, really getting prominent folks in Iowa behind this. And we hope to create a rising tide that the legislature will have no choice but to eventually face. And again, I really think that it's possible to convince folks in the state legislature that it ultimately is in their best interest too. This is just a snapshot I'm very proud of our growth in 2021. We started out our first meetings when we were planning the kickoff event. There were 5 of us, and we now have a list that is close to 800, or well, yeah, 778 people. But this is really just the beginning. At our leadership retreat, we voted that our goal for 2022 is to continue growing at about 15% per month. And that's what that looks like. That puts us at the end of this year with close to 4,000 members on our list. In my excitement to think about what the future holds, also, oops, what happened? I also plotted what that extends to 2023 and looks like, and that gets us up to 20,000 people if we can maintain that growth. Paul's chuckling. Now, it seems like this is a daunting and impossible task, but I actually have seen the plots of how the mailing lists grew for the Maine effort and the Alaska effort, and they did this. So I see no reason why we can't follow suit. It's going to be a lot of work. It's not going to be easy, but it's an important job. With that, I'm going to remind you folks that we are a volunteer organization which has tremendous strengths. I mean, I do our social media, and it says a lot about politics nowadays that most people, when they first encounter our ads, think that we're some sort of astroturfing group. And I just, even though I have no way to communicate that to them yet, I just love knowing in my heart that this was really just founded by a bunch of Iowans who have had very little political experience before, and that we're the real deal. I mean, every dollar that we've raised so far is in small donations from colleagues, friends, and family. But the downside of that is it's very challenging to execute a campaign of this magnitude as an all-volunteer organization. And so we urge you to sign up to our list. I know that mailing lists, everybody gets a ton of emails. We only send out about one, maybe sometimes 2 emails a week. And above all, you're signing up for our list is part of our metrics of how we're growing, how we're touching people. So that alone helps us a lot. By all means, donate. We do have 2 donor matchers up to 25K for new donors here in 2022. And that money is going to go as part of our campaign to hire our first organizer. Above all, we need volunteers. We have a large number of teams. We have a speakers bureau. There are a lot of speakers like myself who are starting to give talks throughout the state. We have a live outreach team, phone banking team, and we need your help in that regard. And of course, making connections. If you have an organization, if you want to invite us to give a talk to your group, all of those things, that's a way that folks on this call can be tremendously helpful and be a voting reform superhero. I'm going to end this talk by asking you to close your eyes and think about the issue of the day that concerns you the most. And I want to suggest that all of the frustration that you experience in that issue not making any progress, not moving forward, just being stuck in a holding pattern, boils down to something more fundamental, that the gears of our political system are no longer working. And that until we get those gears working, all of our issues are just stuck. And I want to suggest that at the heart of all of that is how we pick our leaders. And more importantly, because I actually think we have quite a few good leaders that we've picked, but we give them terrible incentives. And so it's also how we give our leaders incentives to be responsive to us. And if we change that, that opens the door to much more constructive and positive political environment going forward. And so my argument to you folks, a lot of people think that ranked choice voting is some sort of cute intellectual exercise, or just this obscure idea, but I would argue that it really gets to the core of power and accountability and competition in the marketplace of ideas and in our democracy. And so everybody should be getting on board with this so that we can get the political gears turning again, and we can start governing our country functionally and not tearing each other apart at a time when, ironically, we are as prosperous and secure as we've ever been. At a time when politics is most negative, this is really exciting because we have an opportunity to model something positive. We have an opportunity to go out and talk to voters who are different from us. We have an opportunity to turn on light bulbs that have never been turned on, to make people aware of a system that's kind of been invisible and let them know that they can change it, and that by changing it, they can start the ball rolling on actually making American democracy work as it always has. This isn't unprecedented. Reforms like this have been going on even like at the turn of the 20th century. It's how we got out of the corruption of the Gilded Age. There were a lot of reformers, and people think voting has always been the same forever, but it's actually changed a lot in the last century, and we can change it again. And so I ask you all to join us in that, and hopefully we'll bring that change to Iowa, and Iowa will get to the lead of the pack on this issue.